The wind on Thunder Ridge could strip the skin off a man's face in February. On this particular morning, it carried something worse than cold. It carried the smell of gunpowder. Silas Holloway stood alone in the snow, 42 years old, bleeding from a wound in his left side, where a knife had gone in deep. His wide-brimmed hat was pulled low against the storm. His buffalo hide coat was stiff with frozen blood. In his right hand he held a Winchester rifle, the barrel still warm. His left hand rested on the worn grip of a Colt Peacemaker at his hip. Behind him, 50 paces back through the driving snow, a covered wagon sat pulled into the shelter of a stand of lodgepole pines. Inside that wagon was a woman he had known for only 4 days and 7 children he had promised to keep alive. Ahead of him, coming up the mountain trail, 6 armed men rode in single file. The man at the front wore a long scar down his left cheek, a souvenir from a knife fight in a Kansas saloon 15 years ago. His name was Amos Burke, and he had been hunting Silas Holloway for 13 years. Silas did not speak. He did not call out. He simply worked the lever of the Winchester with one hand, the metallic clack swallowed by the wind. He pulled his hat down another inch, and then he began walking forward, not running, not hiding, walking. A man does not walk into 6 rifles because he wants to live. A man walks into 6 rifles because something behind him matters more than his own breath. The image held for a long moment. The snow fell. The blood dripped. The lone figure moved against the 6 riders like a shadow against a coming storm. And then a voice came low and slow, and weathered the voice of a man who had seen too many Decembers. They used to say that out west a man was measured by 2 things: the horse he rode and the thing he was willing to die for. Silas Holloway had lived 42 years without knowing what he would die for. Not through the war between the states, not through the long winters alone in the Bighorn Mountains, not through the graves he had dug with his own 2 hands for the wife and son he had loved more than his own soul. Not until he came down the mountain in the cold month of January 1878 and paid $300 in gold for a widow nobody wanted and 7 children nobody would feed. This is the story of what he found in that wagon, and what he became because of it. 4 days earlier, long before the blood on the snow, before the 6 riders, before Amos Burke climbed that mountain trail, Silas Holloway rose from his narrow bunk in a cabin at 9,000 feet. It was 2 hours before sunrise. The fire had burned down to coals. He stirred them with a stick of pine-added kindling and watched the flames take hold. He had lived in this cabin for 6 years, and in 2 others before it. 11 winters alone in the mountains. 11 winters of silence broken only by the cry of an elk in rut, the howl of a wolf crossing the ridge, the wind speaking to itself in the chimney stack. He drank his coffee black from a tin cup with a dent in the side. The dent had been made by a Minié ball at the Battle of Shiloh in the spring of '62. The ball had struck the cup hanging from his belt and turned itself flat, and a young Silas had spent the rest of that terrible day carrying that cup around in his pocket, wondering at how the Lord sometimes chooses which men to save and which to leave face down in the peach orchard. He checked his horses in the lean-to behind the cabin. Buckshot, the chestnut mare who had carried him for 7 years, nickered softly when she saw him. She was getting old. 12 years old that spring. A man grows attached to a horse the way some men grow attached to whiskey. Dusty, the younger gelding, stamped and tossed his head. Silas saddled them both. He did not know yet why he was saddling both. He had not yet decided to bring the second horse, but some part of him, the part that had kept him alive through 4 years of war, knew before his mind knew. On his kitchen table lay the letter. It had come to him in early December, carried up the mountain by a mail rider named Clem, a boy who would not have made the climb for any man but Silas Holloway. The letter had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had become tears. Silas had read it through perhaps 100 times in 7 weeks. It came from a lawyer in Philadelphia named Aldridge. It informed Silas that Dr. Desmond Ashford had passed away of the typhoid fever early in the previous year. Dr. Ashford had left a will. There had been very little to distribute. A widow, 7 children, a mountain of debt to unscrupulous men. But at the bottom of the will, written in a physician's steady hand, there was one line that was not about money or property. It read as follows: "If I die, send word to Silas Holloway in the Wyoming Territory. He owes me a man's life. He will know what to do." Silas had folded the letter and put it in the breast pocket of his coat. He had gone outside into the December night and looked up at the sky full of stars, and he had spoken aloud for the first time in 3 months. He had said only 2 words. "All right, Desmond." Now, 7 weeks later, on the morning of the 10th of January, 1878, Silas Holloway strapped his Winchester to the saddle, tied down his bedroll, and mounted up. He pointed buckshot down the mountain trail toward the town of Ironwood, crossing Wyoming Territory. He led Dusty behind him on a long rope. The second horse, he now understood, was not for himself. The ride took him 2 days. He stopped that first night at a spring he knew in a small canyon, built a fire of buffalo chips and dry pine, ate a supper of cold biscuit and jerked venison, and slept, rolled in a wool blanket on the frozen ground, with his rifle across his chest and his revolver under his folded hat. A man who has soldiered learns to sleep cold. A man who has hunted learns to sleep light. Silas Holloway had done both for half his life. On the second afternoon, as the pale sun dipped toward the western peaks, he came to the rim above Ironwood Crossing and looked down into the valley. The town was perhaps 200 souls. A cluster of log buildings and 1 or 2 made of milled lumber. A church with a crooked steeple, a bank, a mercantile, 2 saloons, and a long wooden platform at the far end of Main Street that had been built for a purpose Silas understood without being told. On that platform, in 2 days' time, according to the notice he had read in the Wyoming Territorial Herald, the Hebron Bride Society would hold its winter auction. Silas rode down into Ironwood Crossing as the lamps in the saloons were being lit. He stabled his horses at a livery run by a one-eyed man named Kettering, who asked no questions and charged $1 a night. He walked down the wooden sidewalk with his hat pulled low and his coat collar turned up against the cold. He took a room at the Red Buffalo Saloon for 75 cents and he ate a supper of beans and fatback in the corner by the fire, and then he waited. He had come a day early, and he intended to use the day the way a hunter uses the hour before dawn. To watch, to learn, to know the land before he fired the first shot. The morning of the auction came gray and bitter. The temperature stood below zero. A hard wind came down off the mountains and rattled the loose shingles on the church roof. By 8 o'clock, men began to gather around the platform in the square. They came from ranches and homesteads and mining claims and far-off cabins. They came in long coats and wolfskin hats. Some carried rifles. Most carried bottles. Silas sat at a window table in the Red Buffalo Saloon and drank a single glass of whiskey. Slowly, the way a man does when he means to stay clear-headed. He had the window. He had the view. From his chair, he could see the platform. The crowd, the two officials from the Bride Society in their long black coats, and the covered wagon parked to the side from which the women would be brought. The first woman came out at 9 o'clock. She was young, perhaps 20, thin as a post, pretty in a tired way. She fetched $90 from a freighter with a blonde beard. She did not weep. She had done all her weeping before she left St. Louis. The second woman was older, hard-featured, and she went to a rancher for $55 and some agreement about chickens. The third and the fourth went quickly to men who looked at them like a man looks at a mule he intends to work until it drops. And then they brought her out. Silas Holloway set down his whiskey glass and leaned forward. She stepped up onto the platform in a good wool coat that had been mended 3 times along the hem. She was not thin. She was not pretty in the way a man looking for a plaything is pretty. She was a woman who had carried children, buried a husband, and walked through the valley of the shadow without asking for anyone to pity her. She stood perhaps 5 feet and 6 inches. Her hair was the color of wheat in October. Her eyes, even from that distance, were gray and steady, and did not flinch when the first man in the crowd laughed. She held the hand of a little boy, perhaps 3 years old, who hid behind her skirts. Beside her, a girl of perhaps 13 stood straight as a fence post. A boy of 11. 2 boys who had to be twins. 2 small girls. 7 children. Silas counted them twice to be sure. The auctioneer read the notice in a bored voice. Margaret Ashford, widow, 33 years of age, 7 children ages 3 to 13. Opening bid $75. The silence that followed was the worst sound Silas had ever heard in his life. A man in a beaver skin hat spat into the frozen mud. "Too fat," he said, "and 7 young ones to feed. Might as well buy a plague." Another man laughed. A third shook his head and turned away. A fourth called out a cruel thing that Silas will not let himself think about again. The widow on the platform did not flinch. She did not cry. She simply stood and took it the way a good soldier takes fire, knowing that every second he stays upright is a second his children have not yet been taken from him. Silas watched, and he counted more than the children. He counted the men who refused to bid. 47 in all over the next 20 minutes. But more than that, he watched the 3 who did not laugh. The first was a tall man with a long scar down his left cheek, standing at the back of the crowd beneath the awning of the assay office. He did not call out. He did not bid. He simply watched, and his eyes never left the widow. The second was an older woman in a long black coat, one of the officials of the Bride Society. Every few moments she looked back toward the man with the scar and gave a small, deliberate nod, almost imperceptible. But Silas Holloway had spent 4 years reading signals in the middle of battle smoke, and he knew a coordinated signal when he saw one. The third was the preacher of the Ironwood Crossing Church, a gaunt man named Reverend Harlan Doyle, who stood close to the platform and who several times leaned in to speak quietly to the man with the scar. They knew each other. They were working together. And just like that, Silas understood. This was not an auction. This was a performance, a show put on to make the widow think she was worthless, so that when nobody bought her, the officials could step in and divide her family by paper and by law. The children to an orphanage, the widow to a work farm, or worse. The man with the scar had arranged this. He had paid the 47 men in the crowd to refuse her. Every man who laughed had been paid to laugh. The only thing Silas did not yet understand was why. The auctioneer raised his gavel. "Going once," he said. The widow looked down at her youngest child and touched the top of his head. "Going twice," the auctioneer said. Silas Holloway reached into his coat pocket and felt the weight of the leather pouch that held $300 in $20 double eagle gold pieces. He had brought every dollar he had been saving for 11 years, every dollar he had earned trapping and hunting and selling hides. He had not known when he rode down the mountain exactly what he would use it for. He had only known that when the moment came, he would know. The moment had come. He stood up from the table, set his hat firmly on his head, and walked out into the cold. $300. He said it quietly. He did not shout. But he had positioned himself close to the platform, and his voice carried over the whole crowd in the sudden silence. Every head turned. The auctioneer blinked twice, as if he were not certain he had heard. $300, Silas said again. In gold. The widow on the platform did not move, but something changed in her eyes so subtle that only a man watching closely would have seen it. A single flicker. Not hope. Hope was something she had put down long ago. It was the look of a soldier who has heard a bugle where there should have been none. The auctioneer stuttered. "Sir," he said. "You understand, sir, the lot includes 7 children." Silas had not looked at the widow. He had been looking at the man with the scar. The man with the scar was looking back at him, and for the first time in 13 years, the two men were face to face with nothing between them but cold air and the body of a woman who did not yet know she was the prize in a war that had started before she was born. "I know," said Silas. "I counted them before I came down here." And he laid the leather pouch on the edge of the platform. The gold inside rang against the wood, a sound like a judgment being handed down. The gavel came down on the third strike. Sold. The man with the scar did not move, but his hand dropped to his hip, and only a crowd kept him from drawing. The woman in the long black coat had gone pale as chalk. The preacher was whispering rapidly to the scarred man, and the scarred man was not answering. He was just watching Silas Holloway across the crowd, with a look that said he had waited 13 years for this moment, and he had not planned on it ending this way. Silas walked up the steps of the platform slowly, the way a man approaches a skittish horse. He took off his hat. Up close, the widow was more tired than he had realized, and more beautiful than he was prepared for. And he kept his eyes level with hers, because to look away would have been an insult. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, "my name is Silas Holloway. I have a ranch 2 days' ride north of here. The country is hard. The winters are long. But there is a roof and there is food, and there is a bed for every one of your children. I would ask you to come with me." The widow looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at the youngest boy, who was still holding the hem of her coat. The child had lifted his face and was staring at Silas with wide, solemn eyes. In 7 months since the death of his father, Isaac Ashford had not spoken a single word. He did not speak now, but he let go of his mother's coat and reached up, and with one small hand he touched the leather of Silas Holloway's glove. The widow drew in a long, slow breath. "Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice low and steady, "I accept." The paperwork took the better part of an hour. Silas signed his name. Margaret Ashford signed her name. An official stamp was pressed onto a certificate of marriage in the frontier custom. By the laws of the Wyoming Territory, as administered by the Hebron Bride Society, they were now husband and wife. It was not love. It was not courtship. It was a contract written in ink and sealed with gold, and it had saved 8 lives. While Silas waited for the clerk to finish, the woman from the Bride Society approached him. Her name was Mrs. Eliza Crane, and Silas had been watching her nearly as long as he had been watching the scarred man. She was perhaps 52, thin, tightly wound, her hands never still. "Mr. Holloway," she said quietly, "may I speak with you?" They stepped to the corner of the platform, out of earshot of the others. "I know who you are," she said. "My husband was Captain Reuben Crane of the 2nd Ohio Cavalry. He served under you at the Battle of Antietam. You pulled him from under his dead horse and carried him half a mile to the surgeons. He lived to father my 2 children before he fell at Gettysburg the following summer. He spoke of you often. He called you the best man he ever knew." Silas lowered his head slightly. "Ma'am," he said. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Mr. Holloway, I've been waiting 15 years to pay a debt to my husband. I cannot tell you everything, not here, not now. But I will tell you this. The man in the beaver coat standing by the assay office is Amos Burke. He has 6 armed riders waiting at the south end of town. He intended to take Mrs. Ashford for himself. He did not anticipate you. If you leave by the south road, you will be dead by sundown. And she will be worse than dead. Silas nodded once slowly. His face did not change. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. Mrs. Crane reached into the pocket of her long black coat and took out an envelope, yellowed and soft with age. She pressed it into his hand. "This was left for you by my husband before he died. I have kept it for 15 years, not knowing how I would find you. I believe this is the hour for which it was written." Silas took the envelope without looking at it and put it inside his coat against his heart. He touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am," he said, "I will not forget." He did not leave by the south road. He did not even leave by the north road. He took the widow and the 7 children through the alley, behind the livery across a narrow creek that was frozen hard enough to carry a team, and around the back of the cemetery on an old hunter's trail that only 3 men in Ironwood Crossing knew existed. Silas was one of them. The other 2 were dead. He had hitched both horses to the wagon, Dusty in front, Buckshot behind. The second horse was the reason he had brought her. He had known in the gray before dawn on Thunder Ridge that he might be bringing back a weight heavier than one animal could carry alone. Margaret Ashford sat beside him on the driver's seat, wrapped in an extra buffalo robe he had pulled from his own gear. The 7 children were in the wagon bed, bundled in wool blankets, some already asleep from exhaustion. The older ones wide awake and watching the land roll past with eyes that had seen too much. They did not speak for the first 4 miles. At the top of a low ridge, Silas halted the team. He climbed down, took a spyglass from his saddlebag, and studied the trail behind them. After a full minute, he closed. The glass climbed back up onto the seat and picked up the reins. "They missed us," he said. "They are riding south. We have half a day." The widow looked at him. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "I am grateful for what you have done. More grateful than I can tell you. But I am owed the truth. If my children and I are in danger, I need to know what the danger is." Silas was quiet for a long time. The wagon rocked gently. The wind had died. The afternoon sun was low on the horizon, painting the snow the color of weak tea. Then he said, "The man in the beaver coat is named Amos Burke. He has been hunting me for 13 years. He wanted you because he believed that through you, he could finally get to me. I will explain everything when we reach a place where I know my back is safe. That will be sometime tomorrow. Until then, I will ask you to trust me, and I will earn that trust every hour until I draw my last breath." The widow studied his face. She saw the scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. She saw the gray at his temples. She saw the hands on the reins, calloused and scarred and steady as a stone fence. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "I do not know you. But I will tell you what I told my husband when I married him at 18. I will stand beside any man who stands between my children and the wolves. I will not ask him to explain himself until the wolves are gone." Silas inclined his head, the smallest movement, but it was more than he had given to any living person in 11 years. "Yes, ma'am," he said. That night they camped in a box canyon that Silas had used twice before, when he was running trap lines for wolves. He picketed the horses, built a small fire against the far wall. where the smoke would be broken up by the overhang and heated a pot of beans and bacon. The children ate quietly watching him. Only the youngest one, Isaac, came close to him without being called. The 3-year-old walked right over and sat beside him at the fire and reached up to touch the brass of his cartridge belt. Silas did not move. He let the child touch him. After a long minute, Isaac leaned against his shoulder and fell asleep with his face against Silas Holloway's sleeve. The widow watched this from across the fire. She did not comment, but her eyes were bright. It was some time past midnight that Silas took the envelope out of his coat. The fire was low. The widow and children were sleeping under canvas in the wagon bed. He sat alone against a rock at the edge of the firelight, and he broke the wax seal with his thumbnail, and he unfolded a letter that had been written by a man 15 years dead. Silas, the letter began in the cramped handwriting of Reuben Crane. If you are reading this letter, then I am gone, and my Eliza has found a way to get it into your hands. I wish I could deliver it to you myself. I wish I could ride up into those mountains you always spoke of and sit with you by a fire and tell you what I am about to write. But a man only gets one life, and I seem to be spending mine a little faster than I meant to. There are 2 things you need to know. The first is about your brother. On the afternoon after the fight at Gettysburg, I walked the field looking for our wounded. I came upon a Confederate boy who was still breathing, a lieutenant of the Texas Cavalry, and I knelt to give him water. His name tag said Ethan Holloway. I knew the name. I knew the face from the tintype you carried in your pocket. Silas, your brother, lived for 2 hours after you shot him. He knew it was you. He told me to tell you he bore you no ill will. He said he chose his side and you chose yours. And that was the war. He said you were the finest soldier he ever knew. He died holding my hand, Silas, not alone. Silas's hand shook. He closed his eyes for a moment. The wind moved through the canyon. He opened them and read on. The second thing is this. A man by the name of Amos Burke, who rode with your brother's unit, is not what he claims to be. Before Gettysburg, your brother discovered that Burke had been selling intelligence to our side and had been paid in Union gold. The leak from that sale was what drew our regiment into the position where we met your brother's line. Burke caused the ambush that caused your brother's death. Your brother told me this with his dying breath. I have no proof but his word. But his word was enough for me. If ever in the years to come Amos Burke crosses your path, know that he does not hunt you for love of your brother. He hunts you to bury a secret. Be well, Silas. Live long. Find a good woman. Have children. The war is over. Let it stay buried. Your brother in arms, Reuben Crane, Captain, 2nd Ohio. Silas Holloway sat for a long time beside the dying fire. His hands did not tremble. His eyes did not fill. A man who has soldiered learns to carry grief the way a pack mule carries water in small measured portions that do not break him on the trail. But something inside him that had been broken for 13 years began at last to knit. He had not killed his brother as a traitor, for his brother had not counted him one. He had killed his brother as a soldier in a war that had asked too much of a nation and had gotten exactly what it asked for. And Ethan had forgiven him. Ethan had died holding the hand of a friend, and the man who had caused it, the man who had blamed Silas for 13 years and had ridden after him across 6 states to silence the truth, was camped tonight, somewhere south of Ironwood Crossing with 6 armed men at his back. Silas folded the letter. He held it in the flame until it caught. He watched it burn to ash in the cold stone of the canyon floor. He did not need the paper. He had committed every word to the kind of memory that soldiers keep, the kind that does not fade. He stood up, drew his buffalo robe around his shoulders, and walked quietly to the wagon. The widow was asleep with the 3-year-old in her arms. The other children were a tangle of blankets and small breaths. In the moonlight, the boy Isaac had one small hand curled around a fold of his mother's dress, and the other resting open, palm up, as if he were waiting for someone to put something in it. Silas watched them for a long while. Then he went back to the fire and sat the rest of the watch with the Winchester across his knees. And at first light he saddled the team and turned the wagon north toward the high country and toward the ranch called Thunder Ridge and toward the reckoning that had been coming for him for 13 years and that he now understood he had been waiting for all along. A man had ridden down from the mountain to keep a promise to a dead friend. He was riding back up with 8 good reasons to live. The second morning out of Ironwood Crossing came in gray and quiet, the way mornings come in high country, when weather is building somewhere out past the divide. Silas Holloway had been awake since 2. He had spent the last 3 hours of darkness walking the perimeter of the canyon on foot, stopping every 50 paces to listen. At his age, a man does not trust his eyes in the dark the way he trusts his ears. And his ears, trained by 4 years of war and 11 of solitude, told him that they were alone for now. He saddled Buckshot and harnessed Dusty to the wagon while the widow slept. He was careful with the buckles, careful with the traces. The children were bundled together under the canvas like a litter of fox kits, their small breaths rising together in a cloud. Only the oldest girl, Ruth, was awake. She lay still and watched him work through the crack between the canvas flaps, her 13-year-old eyes serious as a judge. He did not speak to her. A man does not need to speak to be understood by a child who is already more grown than her years. He simply looked her way once, nodded, and went on with his work. After a moment, she nodded back. When the first pale light came over the ridge, he climbed up onto the seat and shook the reins, and the wagon moved out of the box canyon and onto the faint hunter's trail that would take them north up into the country, where the trees grew tall and the passes grew narrow, and the law of the territory ran out like rope off the end of a spool. By mid-morning, the sky had turned the color of lead. The widow had taken her place beside him on the driver's seat. She had brushed her hair and twisted it up under a plain wool scarf. Her gray eyes studied the horizon to the west, where the clouds were piling themselves up against the high peaks like cordwood. "Mr. Holloway," she said quietly, "a storm is coming." Silas nodded. I grew up in Pennsylvania hills, she said. I know what a snow sky looks like. He glanced at her. He had been told back at the auction that she came from Philadelphia. He had assumed city-born. He was learning hour by hour that he had assumed too much about Margaret Ashford. My father was a country doctor, she said, answering the question he had not asked. He served the farms along the Susquehanna. I went with him on his calls from the time I could walk. In winter, we rode in a cutter with bells on the harness. I learned to read weather before I learned to read Latin. Silas considered this. And the Latin, he said. She gave the smallest ghost of a smile. Came later. He nodded slowly. I know a place, he said. A trapper's cabin. Half a day's ride from here. We will make it before the worst comes down. He did not tell her, not yet, that the trapper's cabin had once been his own. That was a story he was not ready to tell at 11 in the morning, under a lead-gray sky with the wind beginning to rise from the west. Some stories a man saves for after dark, and for a fire, and for the kind of silence that lets a thing be spoken. That has not been spoken in many years. They reached the cabin at 2 in the afternoon, just as the first hard gusts began to drive snow sideways across the trail. The cabin sat in a hollow beneath a great spruce tree that was older than the Republic. It was small, 3 rooms built low to the ground of squared logs. The door hung true on its hinges. The chimney was clear. The firewood Silas had cut and stacked 11 years ago under the eaves was still there, dry as bone, waiting. He got the widow and the children inside. He unharnessed the horses and walked them around to the lean-to behind the cabin and rubbed them down and forked them hay from the loft, where he had left it years ago. And though the hay was old, it was still sweet enough for horses who had worked a long day. He carried his rifle and his saddlebags into the cabin, stamped the snow off his boots, and closed the door against the wind. The widow had already found the broom where he had left it in the corner. She had swept the floor. She had pulled the oilcloth off the table. She had laid a fire in the iron stove in the center of the room and was building it up with shavings the way a woman who has lived in cold country builds a fire that will not smoke. The children sat along the wall on the split log bench, their eyes large in the lamplight, watching her work. The 3-year-old Isaac had come to stand beside Silas. The child said nothing, but he had wrapped one small hand around the cuff of Silas's coat and was holding on. Silas looked down at him. Then he looked across the room at the widow. She had not seen the child come over. She was bent over the stove, blowing gently on the new flame. Silas did not move. He did not want to move. He stood very still for perhaps 10 seconds, the weight of a 3-year-old's hand against his sleeve pressing down through his coat to a place under his ribs where something had been frozen for 11 years. He felt that place begin to ache, the slow, deep ache of a limb that has been numb too long and is beginning to come back. "Mrs. Ashford," he said quietly. "Your boy." She looked up. She saw Isaac at his side. Her eyes moved from the child to Silas's face and back again. "Isaac," she said softly, "come help Mama with supper." The child did not move. He pressed himself closer against Silas's leg. The widow held very still. Then she smiled, the first real smile Silas had seen on her face in 2 days. "Or stay where you are," she said. "It seems you have found a better place to be." The cabin warmed as the afternoon darkened into evening. The storm came on hard. It drove snow against the little square windows until the glass rattled in the frames. The wind screamed down the chimney like a wounded thing. But inside, the iron stove burned red, and the kettle sang, and the widow fried salt pork and cornmeal in a black pan, while the children sat wide-eyed at the table and ate like wolves. Silas sat in the corner with his rifle across his knees and watched them eat. He had not been at a table with a woman and 7 children in 11 years. Before that, he had been at a table with a woman and 1 boy. And that small blond boy had sat exactly where the 3-year-old Isaac now sat, and had spooned cornmeal into his mouth with exactly the same serious concentration, and had laughed at exactly the same nothing in particular that a small boy laughs at when the world is warm and full. Silas closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the widow was watching him from across the room. She had seen his face. She did not look away. She did not speak. She only nodded once very slightly, the nod of one soldier to another, when both have been hit, and both are still standing. The children slept on pallets along the west wall wrapped in wool and canvas. The 2 smallest slept on either side of their mother on the single cot the cabin possessed. The storm outside ran itself ragged against the log walls and could not get in. When the cabin was quiet, Silas brought 2 tin cups of coffee to the little table by the stove. He sat across from the widow. For a long minute, neither of them spoke. Then she said, "Mr. Holloway, this cabin was yours." He did not answer. He looked down into his coffee. "There is a tintype on the shelf above the wash basin," she said. "A young woman with pale hair and a little boy. I saw it when I went for the soap." Silas nodded once. "I am sorry," she said. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was lower than she had yet heard it. "Her name was Caroline," he said. "She was 21 when I married her at Fort Laramie in 1870. We came up to this country together the spring after. She had been a school teacher in St. Joseph. She could sing. She could read Greek. She made this cabin home with her 2 hands and a pile of flour sacks, and she did not complain, not once, even the first winter when we ran out of coffee in January and did not have any more until April." The widow listened. "The boy was Jasper," he said. "He was born the summer of 71 right here in this cabin. A woman from a homestead 15 miles down the valley came up on a mule and helped my wife through it. He was 4 years old in the fall of 75. He had his mother's eyes. He could sit a horse already. He had a small pony I bought off a drover from Colorado, a paint pony, and he called it Button. And he would ride Button around the cabin in circles and laugh until he got the hiccups." Silas drank from his coffee. The widow did not move. "There was a sickness came into the valley in the fall of that year," he said. "Smallpox, they said. It took 4 families down below us. I took Caroline and Jasper up higher, thinking we could wait it out. But it found us. By the time I rode down for help, my wife was already fevered. The boy 3 days behind her. He stopped. He set the cup down on the table very carefully. "The doctor came," he said. "He rode 70 miles through November snow to reach us. When he got to that door, my wife had been gone 3 hours. The boy lived 4 days more. The doctor could not save him. No man could have. But the doctor stayed. He buried them with me. He stayed 3 weeks after that because he was afraid. And he said it to me in plain words. He was afraid I would put my pistol under my chin the first night he rode out. He sat with me through nights I do not remember. He prayed over me when I was past praying for myself. When he left, he made me promise to live. I gave him my word." Silas lifted his eyes to Margaret Ashford. "The doctor's name was Desmond Ashford," he said. "Your husband." The widow's hand went slowly to her mouth. She sat for a full minute without speaking. Her eyes shone in the lamplight, but she did not let the tears fall. She was not the kind of woman who let tears fall where they could be seen. "He never told me," she whispered. "He would not have said Silas. He was that kind of man." She looked down at her hands on the table. Her wedding ring was still there, though her husband had been dead nearly a year. She turned it once on her finger. "I had wondered," she said, "why a man would ride 2 days through winter to buy a woman with 7 children. I had thought it was kindness or pity or madness or all 3. I did not know it was a debt." Silas shook his head. "It was a debt," he said. "When that letter reached me in December, I knew I would come down. I knew I would come for you whoever you were and whatever condition I found you in. But, Mrs. Ashford—" He paused. He chose the next words as carefully as a man chooses the footing on an ice crossing. "But I have been in that wagon with you for 2 days now," he said. "And what is beginning in me is no longer only a debt. I tell you this so you will know. I will not press you. I will not ask anything of you that you do not freely give. But I will not lie to you about what is in me. You deserve better than lies, and I am done with them." The widow lifted her head. She looked at him for what felt like a long time. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "my husband loved me very much. He was a good man, and he is a good memory. I will carry him to my grave. But I buried him nearly a year ago, and I have walked a hard road since. And I did not expect to find a man at the end of it who would set my children down in a warm cabin and tell me the truth across a table at midnight. Whatever is beginning in you is also beginning in me. I tell you this so you will know." He inclined his head. "Then we understand each other," he said. "We do," she said. Nothing more passed between them that night. He went out once to check the horses in the lean-to. She banked the stove and slept beside her smallest 2 children on the cot. The storm raged until nearly dawn, and then fell off into a windless cold so deep that the pine trees cracked outside in the dark like pistol shots. At first light, Silas went out to bring in firewood, and at the edge of the trees behind the cabin, he found the tracks of a man, one man, walking, not on snowshoes, coming down off the ridge above the cabin. The tracks circled the clearing, once stopped at the edge of the trees, perhaps 80 yards from the cabin door, and turned and walked back up the ridge. Silas read the tracks with the slow care of a man reading a letter from an enemy. They were not Amos Burke's men. Burke's riders were south riding hard, and would not have come alone on foot through that storm. These were the tracks of a man who walked like a mountain. Man walks, placing each foot heel to toe, never breaking a twig. A man who had watched the cabin from the trees for perhaps 15 minutes and had decided to leave without knocking. Silas followed the tracks up to the tree line. At the base of a lodgepole pine stuck into the bark with the point of a skinning knife, he found a scrap of paper. On it was written in a hand he had not seen in 11 years, 2 lines. Heard you bought a family. About time. I will be along. The note was not signed. It did not need to be. Only one man in the Bighorns wrote in that old cavalry trooper's hand, and only one man would have walked up through a blizzard to stand in the trees and make sure Silas Holloway was still alive before announcing himself. Silas folded the paper and put it in his coat. The corners of his mouth lifted not quite a smile for the first time since the auction. "Old Hawk," he said quietly to no one but the morning. When he came back into the cabin with an armload of wood, the widow was kneading biscuit dough on the table. She looked up. "We have a friend," he said. "He will find us when he wants to. He was a sergeant under me in the war. I have not seen him in 3 years. If he comes to the door, do not shoot him. He is uglier than he looks and meaner than he sounds, but he is the second best man I have ever known." "Who was the first?" she asked. Silas set the wood down by the stove. "Your husband," he said. She went back to her biscuits, but he saw her lift one hand to her eye, and she kept her face turned away from him a long moment before she was ready to look at him again. They were snowbound in the cabin for 3 days. In those 3 days, the world outside stood still. The drifts piled up against the cabin walls until they reached the eaves on the north side. The horses were warm in the lean-to. Silas kept the path to the woodpile clear. He kept the path to the outhouse clear. He kept the path to the horses clear. Beyond that, they were an island of light and warmth in a white ocean. And in those 3 days, something began to happen that Silas Holloway had not planned for, and that Margaret Ashford had not planned for, and that neither of them could have stopped if they had tried. They became a family. On the first day, Silas took the boy Henry, 11 years old, out to the woodpile with him. The boy was small for his age, thin in the shoulders, but his eyes were steady. Silas handed him a short-handled axe and showed him how to split kindling against a chopping block. The boy took to it. By the end of an hour, his hands were red, and he had a blister starting, and Silas saw him glance at the blister and then grip the axe harder and keep swinging. Silas did not speak. A boy who has it in him does not need to be told. A boy who does not have it in him cannot be told. That night at supper, Silas passed the boy the salt before the boy asked. It was the first time any man had done that for Henry Ashford since his father had died. Henry took the salt. He did not say thank you. He did not need to. His eyes set it across the table, and Silas's eyes answered, and they understood each other in the way men understand each other, when speech would only get in the way. On the second day, Silas took the two middle boys, the 9-year-old Samuel and the 8-year-old Benjamin, out to the edge of the clearing where the rabbits had been breaking cover under the pines. He showed them how to set a simple snare with a sapling and a loop of wire. He did not lecture. He showed. Samuel, the quiet one, watched Silas's hands with the intensity of a boy learning the only lesson he ever meant to remember. Benjamin, the livelier twin, tried to do it himself on the third attempt and got it right. That night, Benjamin checked the snares at dusk and came back to the cabin holding up 2 rabbits by the hind legs. His face split with a grin so wide it seemed to take half the room. The widow dressed the rabbits and put them in the pot. The boys ate the stew that night with the expression of men who had fed their family, which in fact they had. On the third day, Silas sat by the stove and sharpened the axe head, and the oldest girl, Ruth, brought a book over and sat down across from him. It was the book he had carried up the mountain and down again and up again for 11 years. Plutarch's Lives, the old Dryden translation. The leather cover cracked and rebound with rawhide, the pages soft as cloth from being turned so many times. "May I read it?" she asked. He had not spoken a word about the book. She had found it in his saddlebag while helping her mother unpack. "You may," he said, "but you will not understand the half of it the first time. That is not a fault. It is written for men to grow into." "I can grow," she said. He looked at her. Ruth Ashford was 13 years old, and she had spent the last 11 months holding her mother's family together by the strength of a will that in any boy her age would have been called remarkable. In her, nobody had thought to name it at all. She sat across the table from him with her hands folded on the book and her jaw set, and Silas Holloway saw in her face the same steady light he had seen in her mother's face at the auction. "Yes," he said quietly, "I expect you can." She took the book with both hands and carried it away as if it were glass. That afternoon, while she sat by the window and read, Silas took Henry outside again, this time with an old single-shot carbine he had found under the floorboards. A Sharps in .50 caliber, older than the boy by a decade. Silas checked it, cleaned it, loaded a single paper cartridge, and took Henry out to where a rotten stump stood at 40 yards. He showed the boy how to hold it, how to tuck the butt into the hollow of his shoulder, how to breathe out and hold and squeeze, not pull. "Son," he said, and the word came out of him before he knew it was coming. "Son, never shoot a living thing in anger. A rifle does not know your heart, but you do. A man who shoots in anger will hit what he was not aiming at, and he will carry it the rest of his days. Breathe out. Let the bead settle. Squeeze." The boy fired. The heavy old Sharps rocked his whole body back half a step. The stump at 40 yards jumped a great splinter torn out of its side. Henry lowered the rifle. He looked up at Silas. His small face had gone very still. "You hit it," said Silas. The boy nodded. He did not smile. Silas understood. The first shot a boy ever takes at something meant to be hit is a serious thing, not a happy thing. On the third evening, as the stars came out hard and white, and the temperature at the cabin door dropped to 30 below, Silas was standing at the stove dipping coffee when he felt a tug at the back of his trouser leg. He looked down. Isaac Ashford, 3 years old, was looking up at him. The child had not spoken a word since his father had died 11 months earlier. Not to his mother, not to his brothers and sisters, not to anyone. His silence had become so much a part of him that the family had learned to read his small gestures the way deaf families read hands. Silas went very still. The boy lifted his arms to be picked up. Silas set the coffee down. He bent and lifted the child. Isaac was light as a bundle of kindling. The boy put his small head down against Silas's shoulder and sighed a long, deep sigh, the way a man sighs when he has set down a heavy pack at the end of a long march. Pa said the child. Silas did not move. Pa said the child again into his shoulder. Across the room, the widow had stopped what she was doing. The older children had stopped what they were doing. The whole cabin had gone silent the way a church goes silent in the pause between hymns. Silas Holloway stood in the middle of the cabin floor with a 3-year-old boy in his arms. He did not speak. He could not have spoken. He walked slowly across the room to the bench by the window and sat down with the child still on his shoulder, and he laid his weathered hand against the small back, and he closed his eyes. He had not held a son in his arms in 11 years. He had not known until this moment whether he still had the shape of a man who could hold one. When the widow came quietly across the room and sat beside him on the bench, he did not open his eyes. She did not speak either. She laid her hand light as a leaf on the back of his wrist. She did not take it away for a long time. On the 4th morning, the storm was over. The sky was a hard, clean blue. The snow outside was waist deep in the clearing and shoulder deep in the drifts, and the air was so cold that a man's breath froze on his mustache before he had finished the exhalation. Silas was splitting wood when the dogs in his head finally barked. A man had come into the clearing. He came on snowshoes. He came down from the ridge to the north, moving through the deep powder, with the long sliding gait of a man who had worn snowshoes since he was a boy. He carried a Sharps 50-70 rifle slung across his back. He wore a buffalo coat that came to his knees and a fur cap pulled low. And his beard was white as the snow around him, and he had only one good eye. Silas set down the maul and waited. The man came across the clearing at his own pace. He stopped 10 paces off. He looked Silas up and down. "You have got older," he said. "So have you," said Silas. The man's good eye went past Silas to the cabin. There was a small face at the window pressed to the glass. Then another. Then a third. "God Almighty," said the man. Walter said, "Silas, come inside. I will introduce you to my wife." The white beard of Walter Greaves parted in a slow, disbelieving smile. "Silas," he said, "in all the years I have known you, I never expected to hear those 4 words in that order. Life said Silas has a way. And he turned and led the older man toward the cabin. And as they came to the door, Walter Greaves stopped him with one rough hand on his arm, and he leaned in close and he said in a low voice that the widow and the children could not hear, "Silas, I did not come up here just to say hello. Amos Burke is in Ironwood Crossing as of yesterday morning. He has put word out on the wire. He has sent to Texas for a man by the name of Cyrus Mathers. You know that name." Silas's face did not change, but his shoulders settled. The way a man settles into a saddle when he knows the ride ahead is long. "I know it," he said. "He is a week out," said Walter. "Maybe less. And Burke is hiring every gun for hire between Laramie and the Sweetwater. He means to come up that valley with a small army." Silas nodded once. "Then we will meet him there, and we will meet him ready," he said. Walter Greaves studied his old captain's face. "4 days ago you were a man alone on a mountain," he said. Silas looked past him at the cabin window where the small face of a 3-year-old boy was pressed against the glass watching him. "I was," he said. "I am not now." He opened the door and he took his old sergeant into the warmth of the cabin, and he said the words Margaret Ashford would remember for the rest of her life. "Meg," he said, "this is Walter Greaves. He rode with me in the war. He is the second best man I ever knew, and he is going to help us get home." The widow stood up from the stove. She wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at the one-eyed old mountain man with his snow-crusted beard, and she looked at her husband of 4 days standing beside him. And she understood with the quickness of a woman who has always understood what the men in her life did not need to explain, that the storm outside was over, and a larger storm was coming, and that these 2 men were going to stand between it and her children. "Mr. Greaves," she said, "there is coffee on the stove. Sit down. You are welcome in this house." Walter Greaves took off his fur cap. He bowed the awkward bow of a man who had not bowed to a lady in perhaps 20 years. "Ma'am," he said, "I am obliged." He sat down at the table. The widow poured him coffee. The children gathered around him in a silent half-circle, staring at the one eye and the white beard and the great buffalo coat that steamed in the heat of the stove. The 3-year-old Isaac climbed down off his seat, walked across the room, and climbed up into Silas's lap without a word. Silas sat with the child in his arms. Across the table, Walter Greaves lifted his coffee cup in both hands and nodded slow at his old captain. Silas Holloway nodded back. Outside the cabin, the sun rose higher over the Bighorn Mountains, and the snow in the clearing began to glitter. 80 miles to the south, in the little town of Ironwood Crossing, a man with a long scar down his left cheek stood on the front porch of the Red Buffalo Saloon and watched the eastern sky. And in his pocket was a telegram from Laredo, Texas, confirming that the gunfighter Cyrus Mathers had boarded a train for Cheyenne that morning. Amos Burke smiled without humor. 13 years, he said to the cold. Then he went back inside to finish his breakfast, because he meant to ride at first light the next morning. And a man rides better on a full stomach. In the cabin on the far side of the storm, Silas Holloway held a 3-year-old boy in his lap and drank coffee across a table from the only 2 people left in the world he trusted, and he began quietly to plan a war. They left the trapper's cabin on the second morning after the storm. Silas Holloway had been out since 3 in the dark, breaking a trail with a shovel from the cabin door, down through the drifts to the main wagon road. Walter Greaves had come behind him with a second shovel. The 2 men had worked in silence the way old soldiers work, each of them knowing what the other would do before he did it. By the time the eastern sky was bruising into dawn, they had cut a lane wide enough for the team in the wagon. Meg Ashford was already awake. She had packed the cabin through the hour before sunrise, folded the blankets, wrapped the children in everything warm they owned, tied their small boots tight, and set a fresh loaf of bread on the table for the road, with a hard wedge of yellow cheese and a long strip of jerked venison beside it. She had been the wife of a country doctor for 15 years. She knew how to break camp. They pulled out at full sunrise. Silas drove. Meg sat beside him. Walter rode his own shaggy mountain pony alongside the wagon, with his sharps across the saddlebow. The 7 children were piled in the wagon bed under every quilt and buffalo robe Silas owned. Only the 3-year-old Isaac was not in the wagon bed. The 3-year-old was on the driver's seat in the small space between Silas and Meg, wrapped like a bundle of laundry and perfectly content, and he had refused to be anywhere else. The sky was clean. The snow sparkled. The horses blew long plumes of steam. For perhaps the first hour, no one spoke. Then Walter Greaves nudged his pony up alongside the wagon and said quietly across Meg to Silas, "There is a thing she has not been told. She is owed it." Silas did not answer right away. He chewed his jaw. "She is owed it," he said finally. And with that, Walter dropped back behind the wagon out of earshot to give them the quiet he had just ordered up. Silas drove for another mile. The land rolled out ahead of them, white and blue and enormous. A golden eagle rode a current of air 2,000 feet above them, and did not flap its wings once in 10 minutes. Isaac between them slept with his small head against Silas's ribs. Meg, Silas said at last. She turned her face toward him. "I have told you the name Amos Burke," he said. "I have told you he has hunted me 13 years. I have not told you why. I will tell you now, because when we come to my place, there will not be time." She nodded once. She folded her hands in her lap over the boy's blanket. "I was raised in Virginia," he said. "My father owned land outside Lynchburg. He owned men as well. I will not make that any prettier than it was. In the spring of 1861, I rode north instead of south. My father never spoke my name again. I went into the Union cavalry as a lieutenant. 2 years later, at Gettysburg on the 3rd afternoon of July, I led a charge against a broken Confederate line near a little stone wall. He paused. He let the horses walk. A Confederate officer came up out of the smoke in front of me. He had a pistol. I had a saber. I cut him down before I saw his face. He went under my horse. I rode over him and past him, and I kept going because that is what you do in a charge. I did not learn until a week later from a prisoner in a field hospital that the officer I had cut down was my younger brother, Ethan. He was 19 years old. He had joined the Texas Cavalry against my father's wishes. The widow did not speak. She laid her hand on his forearm and left it there. I believed for 13 years, said Silas, that I had killed my brother and that he had died hating me. 4 days ago, Mrs. Crane pressed a letter into my hand at the auction. Her husband, Captain Reuben Crane, wrote it before he died at Antietam. He was at Gettysburg the afternoon I cut Ethan down. He found my brother alive 2 hours later. Ethan knew who had done it. Ethan sent word through Captain Crane that he bore me no ill will. He said we had chosen our sides, and he had chosen his, and I had chosen mine. And that was the war. He died holding the captain's hand. He did not die alone, and he did not die hating me. Meg's hand tightened on his arm. There was one thing more, said Silas. The letter said that a man named Amos Burke, who rode with my brother's Texas unit, had been selling intelligence to the Union side for gold. My brother had found him out. Before Ethan could report it, the ambush that killed him was arranged by that same information. Burke did not kill my brother with his own hand. But Burke caused the death that I carried out. And he has ridden after me across 6 states these 13 years, not to avenge Ethan, but to bury the truth. Meg was quiet a long time. The wagon creaked. The eagle above them circled. Then she said, "And Caroline, and Jasper." Silas nodded slowly. "There was one thing more that I did not tell you in the cabin," he said, "because I did not want to speak it until we were out on open ground under the sky. Your husband, after he left me in '75, rode back up into my valley 3 months later. He did it alone. He did not tell me. He took samples from my well. He was a physician. He did not accept coincidence the way most men do." She waited. "The well on my place said Silas had been salted with arsenic. Not enough to kill a grown man outright. Enough to mimic smallpox in a woman of 27 and a 4-year-old boy. Your husband wrote me a letter 3 weeks later. He signed it. I have it still in an oilcloth in the bottom of my strongbox at Thunder Ridge. Amos Burke came up into my valley in the fall of '75, when I was at the trading post for 3 days. He could not find me alone to kill me. So he killed what I loved, thinking it would drive me to put a pistol under my chin and finish the job he could not. I almost did. Your husband kept me from it." Meg had begun to weep quietly without a sound. Tears fell on the blanket over the child between them. Silas reached across with one hand and took hers off his arm and held it in his own. His hand was calloused and scarred. Hers was small and cold and certain. "I did not know," she whispered. "He never spoke of you." "He was that kind of man," said Silas. "Yes," she said. "He was." They rode for a while without speaking. Isaac stirred between them and then settled again. His small hand closed around the edge of Silas's coat. Then Meg said, "Nathaniel." Silas turned. "May I call you that?" she said, "when we are alone? Mrs. Crane told me at the auction that your mother called you Nathaniel. I would like to call you that." Silas was quiet a moment. "My mother has been gone since '59, he said. "No one has called me that since. I would like," said Meg, "to be the second." He looked ahead at the long white road rolling out toward the Bighorns. "Yes," he said, "Meg, you may." She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. And that was all. They made Thunder Ridge on the evening of the 6th day out of Ironwood Crossing. The sun was already behind the western peaks. The valley lay before them in blue shadow. Silas drew the team up at the rim and let them breathe, and the widow and the children looked down into the place that was gonna be home. It was not a homestead. It was a holding. A long, low main house of squared lodgepole logs, 2 full stories and a wide covered porch running 3 sides. A stone chimney rising at either end. A bunkhouse of 3 rooms. A barn that could winter 12 head of horse and 40 of cattle. A smithy. A smokehouse. A root cellar dug into the side of the hill. Corrals, hayricks. A windmill over the well that Silas had capped sealed reboard 30 feet to the east and never drunk from the original of again. And up on the hill behind the main house, under a single great cottonwood that stood bare and vast against the darkening sky, 2 grave markers of carved stone. Silas had built it all with his own hands in the 6 years after Caroline and Jasper had died. Not to live in, to keep himself from dying. A man who lays stone and squares timber 14 hours a day does not have the strength left at night to eat his pistol. That had been the secret of the building. And now, 6 years on, it stood finished and empty and ready. Meg looked at it a long time. "Nathaniel," she said, "yes, you built this waiting." He did not answer right away. "I thought I was waiting to die," he said. "Maybe I was building a place where it would be decent to be found." "You were building a home," she said. "You did not know it yet, but you were." He did not answer. He lifted the reins. Buckshot and Dusty leaned into the traces, and the wagon started down into the valley, and the children in the wagon bed pushed their faces up over the sideboard and looked down at the ranch where they were going to live. And Henry Ashford said in a voice loud enough for Silas to hear on the driver's seat, "Mama, is that all ours?" Meg Ashford, her eyes bright in the last of the light, answered him. "Yes, son," she said. "That is ours now." They had 1 week before Amos Burke came. Walter Greaves rode out the first night to bring in the 2 men he trusted in such a country for such a fight. Jeremiah Finn came down from a claim in the Absarokas, 45 years old, thin as a rail, a former Union sharpshooter from Ohio, who in 1864 had shot a Confederate colonel off his horse at 800 yards and had not needed a second round. Elias Thorne came up from Rawlins, 50 years old, a former Texas Ranger who had left the service after the Mexican border fights of '71 and who had not lifted a rifle in anger in 7 years. and who arrived at the ranch in a long duster with 2 colts on his belt, and a look on his weathered face that suggested the 7 years were about to end. Both men had been carried out of a bad scrape once by Walter Greaves. Both men had ridden 12 hours without asking a single question when Walter's note had reached them. That was the way of it out there in that time. A man paid his debts or he did not, and everybody knew which kind he was. Amos Kettering came down from Ironwood Crossing on the 4th day on a borrowed mule with his old Springfield across his back. 60 years old. A Vermont boy who had gone to war at 16 and come home at 19 and never quite come home. He was the uncle of the livery stable owner who had stabled Silas's horses the first night in town. By the 6th day, the ranch at Thunder Ridge held 8 fighting souls. Silas, Walter, Jeremiah, Elias, old Amos, Meg, Henry. And if it came to it, Ruth, who had said nothing but who had quietly taken her mother's old nursing satchel from a trunk and had spent 2 evenings boiling and rolling strips of clean linen and arranging them in bundles by a stove in the kitchen. The younger children had been put to work as well. Samuel, 9 years old, walked the perimeter of the main house twice a day with a slate and drew a map from memory. Benjamin, 8, worked with Silas setting snares along the 3 approaches. Hannah, 6, was given a pair of opera glasses that had belonged to Caroline and assigned the widow's walk on the upper porch, where she could see 3 valleys at once. Abigail, 5, sat in the kitchen and rolled bandages with Ruth. Isaac, 3, sat in the kitchen beside Abigail and handed her the linen 1 strip at a time. There was no panic in the house. There was work. And work, as Silas Holloway knew in his marrow, is the only real cure for fear a man or a child has ever found. On the 5th evening, Silas took Henry Ashford out to the timberline above the west pasture. They walked up through the pines in the last blue light. Silas carried the sharps that had stood under the floorboards of the trapper's cabin. Henry carried his own small shadow. At the edge of a small meadow they stopped. A white-tailed doe was feeding on bark at 60 paces. Silas knelt beside the boy. He put the rifle in the boy's hands. He showed him once more the cheek weld, the breath, the squeeze. The boy settled. The boy breathed. The boy fired. The doe dropped. Henry lowered the rifle and did not move. His face had gone very still. Silas sat down beside him on a fallen log. He did not congratulate the boy. He did not clap him on the back. He let the silence hold. When the boy finally looked at him, Silas spoke. "Son," he said, "the first time I killed a living thing, I was 8 years old. It was a squirrel. I cried behind the barn for an hour. My father whipped me for it. I have thought about that whipping all my life, and I have decided my father was wrong. There is nothing wrong with a boy who mourns what he has taken. It is the boy who does not mourn that you want to watch." Henry nodded slowly. "We will dress her out," said Silas, "and we will carry her home, and your mother will feed your sisters and brothers on that meat for 3 nights. That is what the doe died for. That matters. You remember that." "Yes, sir," said Henry. On the night of the 6th day, they had their betrayal. Walter Greaves had been watching the horse corral from the loft window of the barn because he did not sleep much anymore. At about 2 in the morning, he saw a figure come out of the bunkhouse, cross the yard, and stop at the back of the corral. The figure struck a match. The figure held the match up in a slow, unnatural rhythm. 3. Pause. 2. Pause. 1. The figure was signaling. It was signaling for the second time that night into the hills. Walter climbed down from the loft and walked across the yard and took the figure by the back of the collar. The figure dropped the match and turned. It was Elias Thorne. Walter took him by the collar and walked him straight across the yard and into the front room where Silas was sitting by the fire. And he said, "Silas." Silas stood. Elias Thorne did not try to run. He stood in the middle of the rug with Walter's hand still at his collar, and he looked at Silas, and his eyes were wet. "Talk," said Silas. "They have my daughter," said Elias Thorne. 2 weeks ago, in Rawlins, they came into her boarding house. Lucy. She is 16. They sent a man to my place in the Sweetwater. They wanted a man inside your fight. If I did not give them the count of your guns and the layout of your ground, they said they would take my girl down the trail. They gave me a signal. 3, 2, 1 in a match. He stopped. His shoulders shook once. Silas looked at him for a long moment. Then Silas Holloway did a thing that no man who had ridden with him in the war would have predicted. He crossed the rug. He put his hand on Elias Thorne's shoulder. "Elias," he said, "you are not the first father to be asked this. You will not be the last. You have nothing to be ashamed of, and I will tell you why. A man's daughter is his life. I lost my own boy to men like these. You did not betray us out of weakness. You did what a father is built to do." Elias Thorne closed his eyes. Silas turned to Walter. "Walter, saddle Buckshot and Dusty. Take Jeremiah with you. You ride for Rawlins tonight. You find the girl. You bring her out." Walter did not move. "Silas," he said, "you will be down to 4 guns." Silas nodded. "I will be down to 4 guns," he said. "And Amos Burke will find that out when he gets here and discovers that he came for a turkey shoot and found the turkeys shooting back. Walter, I am not asking you. I am telling you. Go." Walter Greaves looked at his old captain for a long second. Then he gave one short nod. 30 minutes, he said. Then he turned to Elias Thorne and he said, "And you, sir, will stay inside this house with the women and the little children until I bring your girl home. You will not touch a weapon. You will not stand a watch. You will do what the Mrs. Holloway tells you to do. Is that understood?" Elias Thorne nodded. He could not speak. Walter rode out at 3 in the morning with Jeremiah Finn at his side. 2 horses. 4 days to Rawlins and back if they rode hard and changed mounts. Amos Burke was expected at the ranch on the 7th or 8th day. It would be tight. Silas went out onto the front porch after they had ridden out. The stars were hard and cold. The snow in the yard glittered. The front door opened behind him. Meg came out with a blanket and put it around his shoulders without asking. Then she stayed beside him. "You gave up two of your best men," she said. "Yes," he said. "For a girl you have never seen, yes." She looked up at him. Then she said, "I knew before I signed my name on that paper in Ironwood Crossing that you were the kind of man I had hoped still existed somewhere. I had not been sure. You have been answering the question every day since." He turned his head. "Meg," he said. "Yes. If I fall tomorrow or the day after, you will find a strongbox under the floor of this porch third board from the east corner. In it are the deeds to Thunder Ridge, a bank draft in Cheyenne, and my will. All of it is written in your name and the names of the children. I had a lawyer up from Laramie in the fall when I first thought I might come down and see about you." She put her hand flat against his chest. "Nathaniel," she said, "if you fall tomorrow or the day after, I will raise those children on this ground. I will bury you beside Caroline and Jasper. And I will come to that cottonwood every evening of my life and tell you how the day went. Do you hear me?" "I hear you," he said. "And if you do not fall," she said, "then when this is over, I would like to stand up in front of a preacher with you and do the thing properly in front of my children. Not because it is required, because I would like to." He looked down into her face. "Yes, Meg," he said. "I would like that too." He did not kiss her. That was not the way of it with them. He took her hand and he held it against his chest a long moment. Then they went back inside to the fire. The 7th day came gray. The 8th day came gray. On the morning of the 8th day, 1 hour before dawn, the boy Samuel came down the ladder from the widow's walk and said in a low, quiet voice, "Cap'n, there are campfires." Silas went up onto the porch. The valley below them lay in the last of the dark, and out at the south mouth of the valley, in the shelter of a cluster of willow where a creek ran, he could see 3 small red glows. Campfires banked for the night smoldering. He counted them twice. He came back into the house. "Meg," he said, "they are here. Get the children into the cellar. Elias, you go with them. Amos, Henry, you take your positions. It is going to be today." Meg Ashford looked at him one long second across the room. Then she went and woke her children one by one, and she took them down into the root cellar. Under the kitchen floor, where she had made a bed of quilts and straw for them all 5 days ago. She kissed each of them on the forehead. She told Ruth to keep the little ones quiet. She told Henry, who was not going down to the cellar, but up to the attic window with his sharps, to do what Silas told him to do, and not to try to be a hero. Henry said, "Yes, Mama." And then Meg Ashford went and got her own rifle from the pegs by the door, the Winchester that Silas had loaded for her 2 nights before, and she walked to the kitchen window on the north side of the main house, and she took up her position without a single word. Outside in the blue dawn, the figure of a man on a horse appeared at the far end of the valley, then another, then a third. They formed up in a slow, cold line along the ridge, and at their center sat Amos Burke, his coat buttoned to the throat, his scarred face lifted toward the ranch like a man studying something he had waited 13 years to find. On the front porch, Silas Holloway stepped out into the light with the Winchester in his hands. He counted the riders through the spyglass. 11. Burke had gathered every gun he could buy between Laramie and the Sweetwater. 11 against 4. Silas, Meg, old Amos Kettering, and a boy of 11 in the attic. The sun came up over the eastern ridge. The snow lit. The long shadow of the house stretched west across the yard like a pointing finger. Burke raised a gloved hand. The riders split into 3 groups. 5 came down the main trail toward the front yard. 3 swung wide to the west to come at the house from the barn side. 3 swung east to come through the aspen grove by the creek. Burke stayed at the top of the ridge with a spyglass of his own watching. Old Amos Kettering was at the east-facing parlor window with his Springfield. Henry was in the attic with the sharps laid out flat on a folded quilt, his small face calm. Meg was at the kitchen window to the north. Silas took the porch. The first rider came into range at 150 yards, riding hard for the front yard. Silas brought the Winchester up, breathed out, and fired. The rider went off the back of his horse the way a man goes off when the reins go slack and the body does not know it yet. His horse ran past the porch and into the corral and stopped there breathing. The other 4 front riders pulled up. They had not expected a rifleman on the porch. They spread out. They dismounted and took cover behind the low stone wall at the edge of the yard. One of them began to work his way around to the east. He was old Amos Kettering's problem now. A shot cracked from the parlor window. The man working east pitched forward on his face and did not move. Old Amos Kettering, who had not fired a rifle in anger since 1865, had not forgotten the trick of it. On the west side, the 3 riders who had swung toward the barn came under fire from the attic. The sharps was a slow weapon, and a boy's hands on it were slower still. But Henry Ashford, 11 years old, had been taught by a man who told him never to fire in anger and to make the first round count. He did. His first shot took a rider out of the saddle at 90 yards. The sharps bucked against his small shoulder and bruised him blue, and he did not feel it until the next morning. On the east, the 3 riders came through the aspen grove on foot, leading their horses, and walked into the snares. Silas and Benjamin had set 3 days ago. A rawhide loop fired a sapling up out of the snow. A horse went down screaming with a broken foreleg. The rider holding it fell into the second snare, and a deadfall of hemlock logs came down out of the trees on top of him. The remaining 2 riders made it to the creek bank and opened fire on the kitchen window, and Meg Ashford, with steady hands and the cold gray eyes of a woman who had once held a field hospital at Vicksburg with 3 rounds left in a rifle, returned the fire. She hit one through the shoulder. He lay in the snow calling for his mother. The other dropped his rifle and put his hands up, and Meg did not fire again because a woman who had been a nurse knew when the fight had gone out of a man. In the front yard, the 4 remaining attackers were behind the stone wall. They had one man with a repeating rifle who was keeping Silas pinned behind the porch post. Silas waited. He had 2 shots left in the Winchester tube and a full Colt on his hip. And then from the ridge behind them, from behind Amos Burke's own position, a rifle spoke. The man with the repeating rifle behind the stone wall folded over and did not get up. Another shot. The man beside him. Another. The third. The fourth man threw down his rifle and ran. Silas stood up on the porch and looked up at the ridge. A single rider sat his horse there. The rider was silhouetted against the morning sky, a long gray duster, a low black hat, a Sharp's carbine still at his shoulder. The rider lowered the carbine and raised a hand slowly, palm flat, a salute of a kind. Silas did not know the man at that distance, but he did know something else. Whoever the man was, he was behind Amos Burke now, and Amos Burke knew it. Burke turned his horse, saw the rider, and reached for the pistol at his belt. The rider on the ridge did not fire. He simply held up his empty hand in the universal sign of go, as in not me, him. Him down there. Amos Burke did the only thing left to do. He spurred his horse down the ridge toward the house. He meant to finish the thing himself, one way or the other. A man who has hunted another man 13 years does not know any other ending. He came into the yard at a hard gallop. The wounded men at the stone wall were groaning. Silas stepped off the porch with the Winchester up. Burke fired first from the saddle and missed high. Silas fired and his shot went through Burke's horse at the withers. The horse dropped. Burke went over its head and rolled in the snow and came up on his feet with his pistol in his hand. 15 paces, 2 men, 1 long scar, 1 long score. Burke fired twice. The first shot tore a splinter out of the porch post by Silas's ear. The second caught the fleshy part of Silas's left side, high on the hip, and went through clean. Silas did not stagger. He had been hit before. He brought the Winchester up and shot Amos Burke through the breastbone at close range. Burke went down on his knees, then lay back slowly in the snow with his eyes open to the sky. The yard was quiet except for the wind. Silas walked up to him. He kept the Winchester on him, but he did not need to. Burke was not going anywhere. "Holloway," Burke said. His mouth was full of blood. Silas knelt. He did not set down the rifle. 13 years, said Burke. 13 years, said Silas. "I should have salted your well with more," said Burke. Silas did not answer. He did not need to. Burke's eyes moved past Silas to the ridge. "Who?" he said. Silas looked up at the ridge. The rider was gone. "I do not know," said Silas. "You do," said Burke. "You do." And then Amos Burke closed his eyes and he let out a long breath that steamed in the cold, and he did not take another. Silas stood up. His hip was bleeding steadily now into the wool of his coat. He walked back toward the porch, and as he did, the front door of the main house opened, and a 3-year-old boy ran out into the yard in his stockinged feet across the snow, and ran past the dead men and the dying horse, and leapt straight up into the arms of Silas Holloway. Pa said Isaac Ashford. Pa, pa, pa. Silas caught him with his right arm. His left side was going cold, but he held the boy up against his shoulder, and he walked the last 10 paces to the porch, and Meg came out of the kitchen with her rifle still in her hand, and she took one look at the blood on his coat, and she said, "Ruth, bring the satchel." And the siege of Thunder Ridge was over. They had not counted Reverend Harlan Doyle. The preacher had ridden up with Burke's company but had not fought with them. He had been in the bunkhouse the whole time waiting for the shooting to stop. When he heard Burke's last shot and saw through the bunkhouse window that the yard had gone quiet, he made his move. He came out of the bunkhouse with a small Derringer pistol in his sleeve and walked along the covered side of the barn to the back of the main house, and he meant to enter through the kitchen door while Meg was on the porch with Silas. He had almost reached the kitchen when the 3-year-old Isaac, who had gone back inside with his mother, saw him through the kitchen window. The boy had never raised his voice in all his life, but he opened his mouth now and he screamed one word at the top of his lungs. Pierre. Silas was on the porch. He heard the word the way a man hears a rifle shot in a church. He turned. He drew the Colt Peacemaker from his hip because the Winchester was empty and because he did not have time to think, and he ran around the side of the porch. Reverend Harlan Doyle was standing at the kitchen door with the Derringer pointed at Meg Ashford's back. Silas did not say, "Drop it." He did not say, "Turn around." He shot Reverend Harlan Doyle through the side of the neck from 20 feet and did not miss. The preacher folded. The Derringer went into the snow. Silas stood in the yard with the smoking Colt in his hand. His side was cold as stone now. His legs felt strange. He looked up at the kitchen window. Isaac Ashford was standing on a stool there, his small face pressed to the glass, his eyes enormous. Pa, the boy said this time quietly through the glass. "I am here, son," said Silas. And he sat down in the snow because his legs would not hold him anymore. 3 days later, Walter Greaves and Jeremiah Finn rode into Thunder Ridge with a 16-year-old girl named Lucy Thorne, sitting on the pommel of Walter's saddle. They had found her locked in a back room of a crib house, 2 blocks off the main street of Rawlins. They had not needed to kill anyone to get her out. Walter had simply walked in the front door of that establishment with his Sharps 50-70 across his arm and had suggested in a conversational tone that every man in the building had 3 seconds to decide whether this was the morning he wanted to die. Every man had chosen otherwise. When Lucy Thorne slid down off Walter's saddle in the yard at Thunder Ridge and saw her father standing on the porch, she did not cry. The Thornes were not much for crying. She walked to him and she stood in front of him, and she put one hand against his face, and Elias Thorne closed his eyes and did not open them for a long time. That same afternoon, the rider from the ridge came into the yard. He came at a walk, his horse a little lame on the left forefoot. He stopped 20 yards from the porch and got down and removed his hat. He was 55 years old, gray in the beard, pale in the eye. His long duster was dusty from the trail. Silas Holloway watched him from the chair on the porch, a chair Meg had set there so he could sit up while his hip healed. The rider walked up and stopped at the foot of the porch steps. "Holloway," he said. Mathers said Silas. Cyrus Mathers nodded once. "Burke wrote me a letter in December," he said. "He paid me in advance. I was to meet him in Cheyenne and then come north. He told me you had killed your brother as a traitor and deserved to die for it. I read the letter 3 times. I did not believe it on the second reading, and I did not believe it on the third. I telegraphed a friend in Washington who has access to the War Department rolls. The rolls said your brother was killed in a general engagement at Gettysburg. They did not say he was a traitor. So I went to Laredo instead of Cheyenne. I rode north alone. I meant to look you in the face before I decided what I was gonna do." Silas did not speak. Cyrus Mathers looked up at him. "I was on the ridge behind Burke this morning," he said. "I watched you for an hour before I fired. I watched you put a boy in an attic window with the Sharps. I watched you put a woman at a kitchen window with a Winchester. I watched you set a table on that porch with your wife and drink coffee half an hour before the shooting started, the way a man drinks coffee before going out to his own burial." He paused. "A man who sets his house that way," he said, "did not kill his brother in cold blood. I decided that before I fired the first shot. I fired the shot anyway because Burke paid in advance, and I do not like to leave a man unpaid for work I did not finish." Silas almost smiled. He could not quite for the hip. "Come up on the porch, Mathers," he said. "There is coffee. There is a table. Sit down." Cyrus Mathers climbed the porch steps. He sat down in the second chair. Meg came out of the house with a tin cup and poured him coffee without asking. Cyrus Mathers thanked her with a nod that was as formal as a bow at court. The 3 of them sat for a long time on that porch without speaking. Somewhere inside the house, the younger children laughed at something. The sound of it was the only sound in the valley. After a while, Cyrus Mathers said, "Holloway, I have an address in Laredo, Ellsworth's Saloon. If ever you have a day when 5 men on horseback are coming up this trail, and I am not already here, write to that address. They will find me." Silas nodded. "And Mathers," he said. "Yes. The same is true the other way. If ever you come to a day when you need a place that no man will ever find you, there is a bunkhouse here. It will be cold in winter, but it will be here." Cyrus Mathers did not answer, but he held out his hand. Silas took it. The 2 men shook once hard, the handshake of old enemies who had walked past the moment of becoming enemies and had found themselves, without planning it, something harder to name. Cyrus Mathers stayed 3 days at Thunder Ridge. He ate at the table. He split wood for his keep. He did not speak often, and when he did, it was never about himself. On the morning of the 4th day, he saddled his horse and rode out before sunrise. None of the children saw him go. Meg had left coffee and biscuits for him on the kitchen table. He took them without a note. The winter passed. Silas healed slowly. The hole through his hip had been clean, but it had taken muscle that does not come back the way it was. He would walk with a slight limp for the rest of his life. It did not slow him down much. It only gave him a way to tell the weather before a storm came in because the hip ached when the pressure fell. Walter Greaves went back to his own cabin 15 miles down the valley. He came to Thunder Ridge for Sunday dinner every week. He taught Henry Ashford to track elk. He taught Samuel Ashford to tan a hide. He taught Benjamin Ashford to smoke a ham. He taught Hannah Ashford to shoot a bow. Abigail Ashford taught him in return how to braid a ribbon into a child's hair. Walter had never learned such a thing in 65 years of living, and he considered it a fair trade. Elias Thorne stayed on at the ranch as foreman. His daughter Lucy moved into the bunkhouse with him and kept the books for the cattle operation. Old Amos Kettering stayed too, because his cabin in Ironwood Crossing was a cold place for an old man, and the Ashfords had more room than they needed. The children called him Uncle Amos before the first spring was out. Jeremiah Finn drifted back to his claim in the Absarokas, but came down every few months with a pack of hides to trade and a new book for Ruth. In April, the snow began to go. The lupine came up along the creek blue as a clear morning. The Indian paintbrush followed red as a wound. The meadowlarks came back. Henry Ashford shot his first coyote. Samuel Ashford drew a pencil sketch of the main house that was so true to life that Meg framed it in the parlor. Isaac Ashford, who had said only one word in 11 months, and then had said one more to save his father's life, began at last to speak in full sentences, and once he started, he did not stop for 12 years. On a clear Sunday morning in the middle of April, Silas Holloway walked with Meg Ashford up to the hill behind the main house. The cottonwood was in early leaf. The grass was coming in. The 2 gravestones stood as they always had, but now around them somebody had planted wild lupine and left it to grow as it wished. Silas walked to the first stone. He took off his hat. He stood there for a long time without speaking. "Caroline," he said at last. "Jasper." He put his hand flat on the stone. "I have told you about her already," he said. "I have told you up here at night many times, so you already know. I am telling you this morning that I am going to ask her today. I wanted to tell you first. I wanted to hear what you had to say." He waited. The wind moved in the cottonwood. He nodded once. "All right," he said. He came back down the hill to where Meg was standing. He had her hand in his. He walked her over to the 2 gravestones. "Meg," he said, "yes, I have lived 11 years looking at these 2 stones. I thought I would die looking at them. I thought the only thing left of me was what I left up here in 75. I want to tell you in front of them because I want them to hear it. That I was wrong. There was more of me left than I knew. Your husband knew it. That was why he kept me alive. He was saving me for you, and he did not say so even to himself because he was that kind of man, but he knew." Meg's eyes were shining. Silas Holloway went down on his one good knee in the wet April grass. He took from his breast pocket a ring. He had made it himself over the winter in the smithy behind the barn, out of a silver dollar minted in 1865, the year the war ended. He had worked it and polished it, and it gleamed in the morning sun. "Meg," he said, "I am asking you in front of Caroline. in front of Jasper, in front of the two of them who know me better than anybody on this earth will ever know me. Will you be my wife?" Meg Ashford put her hands over her face for a moment. Then she took them away and the tears were running now. And she was not ashamed of them at all. "Yes, Nathaniel," she said. "Yes." He slipped the ring on her finger. He got up off the wet knee. He held her against him for a long moment there on the hill with the wind moving in the cottonwood and the meadowlarks calling down in the pasture. Walter Greaves married them 3 weeks later on that same hill. There was no preacher. After what Reverend Harlan Doyle had been, Silas would not have another man of the cloth stand before his family without first having come to know him well. So Walter Greaves, who was nothing but an old cavalry sergeant with a white beard and one good eye, did the office. He said he had done it once before for 2 homesteaders in Montana in '71, and nobody had complained. He stood between the 2 graves and the 2 living people, and he said the words he had worked out the night before at his own kitchen table. "Silas Holloway," he said, "do you take this woman, Margaret Ashford, to be your wife and her children to be your children, and this ground to be her ground, as long as you both draw breath?" "I do," said Silas. Margaret Ashford said, "Walter, do you take this man Silas Holloway to be your husband, and his name to be your name, and this valley to be your valley, as long as you both draw breath?" "I do," said Meg. "Then, by the authority of the laws of this territory, and by the authority of the 2 people on this hill behind you, who are not here to speak, but who I judge would approve, I pronounce you man and wife. You may mark it in whatever way seems fitting." Silas did not kiss her in front of everybody. That was not his way. He simply touched the brim of his hat, and she touched the edge of his coat, and Walter Greaves said, "Amen," and the wedding was done. They had a supper afterward on the long porch of the main house. Walter Greaves ate 3 helpings of roast venison. Jeremiah Finn had come down from the Absarokas for it, and old Amos Kettering had come in from the bunkhouse, and Elias Thorne sat with his daughter Lucy at the end of the table and held her hand without letting go of it. And the 7 Ashford children, who were now 7 Holloway children in every way that mattered, ate pie until they could not eat any more. Mrs. Eliza Crane came up from Ironwood Crossing by wagon for the wedding. She had resigned from the Hebron Bride Society in February and had written a letter to the Wyoming Territorial Herald, naming names and telling the whole of what Burke had done and what the society had done for him. 12 arrests had followed. The society had been shut down by the territorial legislature before the thaw. She presented Silas and Meg with a set of china from her own kitchen. The good pieces her mother had carried in a barrel from Ohio in 1844. She said she had been waiting 15 years to pay a debt to her husband, and she was paid now, and she could go home with her shoulders a little lighter than she had come. That night after the supper, after the children had been put to bed, Silas and Meg walked out together onto the porch. The stars were thick as sugar over the Bighorn Mountains. From the pasture came the faint lowing of cattle. From the bunkhouse came the sound of Jeremiah Finn's fiddle playing a slow mountain air that did not have a name but that every man in the valley knew. Meg leaned against him. He put his arm around her shoulder. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes. I think we will be all right." "Yes, Meg," he said. "I think we will." They stood there a long time, neither of them talking because there was no need. The voice that had told their story at the beginning came back now low and slow and weathered. Silas Holloway lived another 45 years. He and Margaret raised 7 children and had 5 more of their own. Between 1879 and 1891, 3 boys and 2 girls, every one of them born in the upstairs bedroom of the main house at Thunder Ridge, every one of them delivered by their mother's hands, with Ruth Ashford assisting before Ruth was old enough to wear long skirts. Ruth Ashford went east to Boston in 1883. Silas paid her way. She studied medicine at the only school in the country that would take her. And she graduated 4 years later. And she came home to Wyoming and opened a practice in Cheyenne, and she became the first woman licensed to practice medicine in the territory that would in a few years become the state. She died in 1961 at the age of 96, attended at her bedside by a great-granddaughter who had followed her into medicine. Henry Ashford grew up to run Thunder Ridge. He expanded it from 1,200 acres to 3,500. He married a rancher's daughter from Sheridan in 1901 and had 6 children, the oldest of whom he named Silas. Samuel Ashford became a painter. His landscapes of the Bighorn country hang today in the Denver Art Museum and the Amon Carter in Fort Worth. He never married. He lived alone in a small cabin he built himself on the north edge of the ranch and died there in 1944 of a heart attack with a brush still in his hand. Benjamin Ashford became a peace officer in Cheyenne. In 1902, he walked unarmed into a bank that was being robbed and talked 3 gunmen into putting their pistols down. He was awarded a commendation by the governor and wore it for the rest of his life on the inside of his vest, where no one could see it. Hannah Ashford taught school for 41 years in a 1-room schoolhouse on the Bighorn Reservation. She married a rancher from Buffalo in 1910. She was remembered by 3 generations of her students as the woman who had sung them to sleep during the hard winter of 1909, when the snows had trapped them all in the schoolhouse for 11 days and the roof had groaned, and she had sat up all of every night keeping watch with the lantern. Abigail Ashford married Lucas Kettering, the nephew of old Amos Kettering, in 1895. They had 6 children. They ran a dairy farm on the east side of the valley until 1941, when Lucas passed and she moved back into the main house at Thunder Ridge and lived there with Henry's son and his family until her own death in 1953. Isaac Ashford became a preacher. He was the boy who had not spoken for 11 months and then had spoken 1 word to save his father's life, and then had not stopped speaking for 12 years. When he was 18, he told Silas he felt called to the ministry. Silas said that he had known 1 preacher in his life, and that had been a man named Doyle, and that Doyle had been the worst man Silas had ever met. Isaac said that was why the job needed better men in it. Silas looked at him for a long time, and then he wrote a letter to a seminary in New Haven, Connecticut, and paid the tuition by selling 40 head of cattle that he had not meant to sell that year. Isaac came home in 1894 with a degree and a license to preach. He built a church with his own hands in Ironwood Crossing on the lot where the Red Buffalo Saloon had once stood. The saloon had burned down in the fire of '89. The new church stood on the foundation of the old barroom. Isaac Holloway, as he styled himself in his preacher's robes, served that congregation for 48 years, on the last Sunday of every month. All the way to the end, Isaac Holloway would end his sermon with the same line. He would close his Bible. He would look out at the men and women in the pews, at the old cowboys and the wives and the children they had brought, and he would say it in a voice that was quiet, but that carried clear to the back wall. "My father paid $300 for my family," he would say. It was the cheapest deal in the history of the West, and the whole church, men and women both, would answer him, "Amen." Silas Holloway died on a Sunday afternoon in September of 1923. He was 87 years old. He had gone out that morning to ride the west pasture with his oldest grandson, a boy of 14, and he had come home at noon, sat down in his chair on the porch, and had taken Meg's hand. He had closed his eyes. He had told her that it had been a very good day, and that he thought he would rest. She was still holding his hand an hour later when she felt him go. They buried him the next afternoon on the hill behind the main house, beside Caroline and beside Jasper, under the great cottonwood. Meg lived another 11 years sleeping alone in the upstairs bedroom, rising every morning at 4 to make coffee, because that had been his way. She died in 1934 and was buried beside him. The stone over Silas Holloway's grave reads 4 lines. Silas Nathaniel Holloway, 1836 to 1923, husband, father, rancher. He kept his word. That is the whole of the story. A man came down off a mountain one January morning to pay a debt to a dead friend. He paid the debt. He paid more than the debt. He paid it so fully that he never finished paying all the days of his life, and went on paying it into the next generation and the one after that, which is how a debt of honor works when it is held by the right kind of man. Out there in the high country, under the bighorn sky, in a valley called Thunder Ridge, the cottonwood still stands. The main house still stands. The stones on the hill still stand. The great-great-grandchildren of Silas and Margaret Holloway still run cattle on that ground, and every January in the little church in Ironwood Crossing, the descendants of the 7 Ashford children gather for a supper they have held every year, without fail, for 147 years. At the end of the supper, the oldest member of the family present rises and lifts a glass and says one thing. To the $300, they say. And every voice in the room, young and old, answers, "Amen."